Does an apple a day keep the doctor away? Well, not quite for Steve Jobs. The public face of the company has taken his third medical leave of absence. The unexpected news came amid blowout results, nonetheless, for the company. And while punters say Apple's product roadmap is set and ready for very crisp execution, others wonder what an Apple without Jobs might eventually look like. What happens when you cross Henry Ford with Willy Wonka? According to Piper Jaffray tech guru Gene Munster, you get Steve Jobs. So no surprise, given his celebrity status, his absence is causing a bit of an uproar.
Steve Jobs is the heart and the brain of Apple, and as long as nobody knows how long he will be away, the speculation in Apple will go on.
After all, it was under Jobs' leadership that iPod became for MP3 players what Coca-Cola is for cola drinks. The iPhone sparked a consumer rush into the smartphone market that was dominated by business folks. And the iPad made tablet computing today's norm. So, what now? Will Apple crash without Steve Jobs at the helm?
Not having Jobs there is a serious issue for Apple. I mean, he's clearly the visionary genius behind all the products.
Apple's lined up a long bench of talent that together could offer the same vision that Jobs had. Player one, Tim Cook, the man touted to replace Jobs eventually. This is the second time Cook's taken control of Apple's day-to-day operations. In fact, Apple liked him so much the first time around they gave him the more than $20 million bonus. Phil Schiller's got global marketing under his wing. He's also Apple's most prominent social media presence through his Twitter account. And top product designer John Ive, Apple Store creator Ron Johnson, and software wizard Scott Forstall have made Apple's products the go-to gadgets, and there'll be more.
Apple still has some very strong products in the pipeline. The iPad 2 is expected probably in the second or third quarter, and the iPhone 5 will come out also probably sometime in the summer.
Players and products in place, there is hope yet that Apple continues with its cutting-edge, soaring stock, spit, and polish. Let's hand it over to our tech expert panel for the session of Straight Talk. James Sullivan, J.P. Morgan, Nitin Frost, and Sullivan both join us from the SPX in the Lion City. James, Nitin, either one of you take this one up. What is Apple without Steve Jobs? It's not the first time. You'd think that they deepened the bench in the last few years, right?
Let me take it up first. I think I agree with some of the sentiments that have been expressed in the sense that Apple without Steve Jobs is a big risk. But I would want to kind of pepper that statement with the fact that if it's a short-term absence, Apple does have a good pipeline going into the next 9 to 12 months. A short-term absence may not be much of a challenge. A long-term absence in terms of how Steve Jobs has been able to create new product categories from scratch, has had the vision of actually making a choice in terms of which products to take to the market. I think that is a big risk Apple would definitely face. But I think at the same point in time, there is a chance that Tim Cook could surprise us all.
James, do you share Nitin's sentiment, or do you think that maybe the fortunes of Apple are still inextricably linked to this man?
I think it's important to focus here on the bigger picture, which is that Apple has a couple of key structural challenges, particularly for a lot of the Asian telecom operators that we cover. Number one, the ecosystem challenge that they face, which is simply that the amount of content that exists within the Apple App Store and iTunes within most Asian markets is severely limited compared to what they have in Western Europe and the US. And so the overall strength of the ecosystem from a content perspective is significantly more challenged within most of Asia than it is in the States. The other key structural challenge that I see them facing in terms of broad-based adoption of their products is simply the price point. We're now starting to see sub-$100 smartphones, full touchscreen models coming from some of the Chinese operators in particular, Android-based, a lot more content that's accessible to a lot of the Asian consumers because of the openness of the Android platform. And so I think it's important to push Apple's current issues into the bigger picture, which are the structural challenges that they could potentially face with growth here in Asian markets moving forward.
Okay, Nitin, I'll give you the last word on this particular issue. James cited Android. I recently became an Android user. There is a multitude of free apps out there, and they give you a lot of choice. With Apple, you're tied to iTunes, you're tied to Apple, basically. Do you think that they're going to find it harder to come up with these killer apps in the future? Do you think the iPad, in any way, might be their last hurrah?
Actually, I would look at it from a different perspective. The reason Apple has been very successful is the fact that it's never a market leader. So if you look at the PC market, if you look at the phone market, if you look at even the new emerging tablet PC market, where it is the leader, but it will not be the leader for a very long period of time. They do well when they are a small player and they continuously have that DNA, if you will, to be a market challenger. And I would tend to think that being in that position will always lead them to test the boundaries, go beyond what other players are coming up with, and therefore still be at the cutting edge of giving us, whether it's applications, whether it's business models, whether it is anything else. A point to note is that iTunes, you cannot still buy anything from iTunes in Singapore. But in Singapore, in terms of the penetration of smartphones, Apple probably has more than 50% market share. So there is definitely something in it which makes them successful.
Great. All right, Nitin, James, here's another sidebar issue for Apple. Facing the wrath of environmental groups in mainland China, 36 of these organizations have accused the company of failing to address pollution and health issues at factories supplying Apple components. In a ranking of 29 international IT companies, Apple came in at the very, very bottom. And basically what these groups were saying, James and Nitin, was that Apple just ignores inquiries into worker welfare and the way that workers at a lot of their subcontractors, monitor makers, for instance, are treated. Do you think this is going to blow up in Apple's face, or do you think Apple has such goodwill out there in the consumer market that this is really a very, very distant sidebar issue? James, you want to take this one?
Sure. I think first it's important to recognize the importance of that issue to consumers in various different geographies. That's getting far less press here in Asia than it is in a market like the U.S., and I don't see it significantly impacting their sales in most of the markets that we cover. A lot of the outsourcing that's occurred for all of the tech companies have gone out to factories across all of China that are moving very quickly, that move locations very quickly. So the amount of control that they can physically assert over these factories, I think, is difficult at best. But certainly from an Asia growth perspective, I think it's very important to recognize that this issue has gotten far less play in most of our markets.
Okay,
I think
Nitin, go ahead.
I think they would at some point in time need to act on it, as in we had similar situations with Nike and Reebok if we go back 10-15 years back, and the argument was similar, that we outsource it to factories in Asia and we are not kind of concerned with how they run their practices. I think at some point in time it could become a slightly bigger issue than what it is at this point in time, but I think that point in time we have not reached as yet.
Yeah, it's a little difficult to track, isn't it? People still want to get their hands on the latest gadgetry, and when they, announce the iPhone 4, iPhone 5, iPad 2, people are more interested in what it has to offer rather than the, paper trail of suppliers. But, fair trade came to the coffee market, and who knows, sooner or later it'll be very part and parcel of the IT market. And finally, out of Silicon Valley this week, another big shakeup, a new page out of the playbook at Google, as Schmidt calls it, quits, in a sense. Google announcing this week its co-founder Larry Page will become the new CEO. The incumbent Eric Schmidt, who'd been in the job for no less than a decade, will step aside come April. He will be executive chairman, so he's hardly retiring and hitting the golf course. And Eric is going to concentrate on deals and government outreach and outsource some of the day-to-day to Larry Page. The shakeup comes as Google posted a one-third jump in fourth quarter net profit and top-line revenues. Many see the move as Google's response to fast-growing social media like Facebook and Twitter. James, Nitin, final topic for our speed panel today. Schmidt stepping aside, making room for younger blood. A lot of people, some of the skeptics said, well, wait a minute, they're doing so well, their earnings are doing great, their revenue line is doing great, they're doing great with Android. Why mess with something right now? There must be something amuck there. That's sort of a negative, skeptical view of things. James, how did you read this when you heard the Goog news?
I think very clearly Google's at a critical juncture in terms of its development as a company. The revenue and the earnings stream continue to be driven heavily by the search product, and clearly what they're trying to do is define themselves as an ecosystem player similar to what Apple has done so successfully in its space, with primarily the development of Android, but also with Chrome and some of the other operating system type platforms that they're trying to develop. So a change in leadership at this stage I actually think does make a degree of sense, because again, they're trying to define themselves as a very different type of company going forward and becoming more of an operating platform versus just a search engine and advertising provider, which is clearly what they've been historically.
Yeah, Nitin, do you think Google's taking the right track right now? I mean, right now they're on the Froyo 2.2, which is a little buggy. They're going to be moving to Honeycomb, the 2.3 and beyond and beyond. I mean, there could be a lot of incremental improvements for a long, long time. They're sort of headed down this path. Is this the right route for this company to be taking, in your view?
I think we should look at what Eric Schmidt said, I think in one of his Twitters or in one of his blogs, that adult supervision for Google is over. So in some way it was kind of expected that that he was an interim CEO as the founders began to reach a certain amount of experience in running an organization, they would come up and take the helm. So I would say in some ways it is kind of expected, and I think more importantly the challenge Google is facing is in terms of, other than the product segment, so on and so forth, is attrition of employees. The best of employees were trying to leave Google and move on to Facebook, while it was being run in a very entrepreneurial style, if you will. So allowing them to have a younger CEO may kind of try to prevent to a certain extent that flight of talent that they would want to retain, and therefore be a bit more aggressive in certain of the newer ideas that they could be coming up with. So I think at this point in time it is the right thing to do, as long as Eric doesn't completely dissociate himself with Google, which he is not planning to do. So I would think it's still a positive for Google at this point in time.
James Sullivan, JP Morgan, Nitin Bhatt, Frost & Sullivan, thanks guys for your time. Coming up next, it's just a fraction of the size of China, but here in Hong Kong, the resident on average consumes 7 times as much as a mainland peer. What's going on? Are we slurping too many noodles? We'll talk that through right ahead.